My name is Serena Faith. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind on the surface: gentle, agreeable, supportive. I work in a role that doesn't attract applause. I'm not the loudest person in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. And because of that, people often assume they understand me. They see the soft voice and think uncertainly. They see the patience and think passive. They see the calm and think incapable. I learned early that when you're quiet, people project their own assumptions onto you. Sometimes those assumptions are harmless. Sometimes they're convenient. And sometimes they're dangerous. This story is about the moment I realized that being underestimated can either shrink you or position you. It's about the day I discovered my own family had told my fiancé I was financially worthless, not irresponsible, not inexperienced, worthless. They said it gently, of course, with concern, with smiles, with that particular tone people use when they believe they're being helpful. But words, even polite ones, leave marks. I didn't explode, I didn't cry, I didn't defend myself in the moment. That's not who I am. Instead, I did what I've always done. I listened, I observed, I remembered. And then I made a decision. This isn't a revenge story. There's no screaming at dinner tables, no dramatic exits, no sudden windfalls or miracles. It's quieter than that, more methodical. It's about understanding leverage. It's about silence that is chosen, not imposed. It's about what happens when the person everyone thinks is safe to dismiss decides to stop explaining herself. When I finally showed my fiancé something my family never knew existed, my investment portfolio, it wasn't a weapon. It was clarity. Because the truth is, I was never financially worthless. I was simply not performing well in a way that made them comfortable. They underestimated the quiet one. If you've ever been misread because you didn't feel the need to advertise your strength, if you've ever been assigned a smaller role than you actually fit, then you may understand the space I was standing in. So let me tell you how invisibility can become an advantage. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that changed how you saw yourself? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was to them first. In my family, I was the steady one. Not the star, not the rebel, not the prodigy, just steady. My older brother was the risk taker. He started businesses, talked loudly about expansion, and used words like equity and scaling at Thanksgiving dinner. My younger cousin worked in tech and casually mentioned stock options the way other people mention the weather. My parents admired ambition that made noise. They liked visible growth, promotions with titles, cars that signaled progress. I had none of those things. I worked as an operations coordinator at a nonprofit in Seattle. My job was to make sure things didn't fall apart. I built systems, managed budgets quietly, and solved logistical problems before they became visible. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive in dinner conversations. It didn't come with headlines. And I didn't correct anyone when they assumed it meant I was barely getting by. At family gatherings, I was asked different questions than everyone else. Are you still at that organization? That must be fulfilling. You've always been so content with simple things. Content. That word followed me like a label I never chose. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder to protest. No one insulted me directly. They just positioned me gently below the threshold of significance. When I got engaged to Daniel, their curiosity shifted. They liked him immediately. He worked in commercial real estate. He spoke confidently. He knew how to shake hands in a way that made people feel important. He had what my family understood as momentum. At dinner one evening, my aunt leaned toward him and said, smiling, "You're going to have to teach Serena about investments. She's never been interested in money." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled too. Because correcting them would have required revealing something I had no interest in performing. For 10 years, I had been investing quietly. Every bonus, every tax return, every month I could manage. Index funds, dividend stocks, a few calculated risks. I read annual reports at night the way other people watch television. I tracked market cycles in a slim black leather ledger I'd kept since I was 22. No one knew. Not because it was a secret, but because no one had ever asked the right question. There's something strange about being underestimated consistently. At first, you try to earn different assumptions. You speak up more. You hint at accomplishments. You adjust your tone. When that doesn't work, you begin conserving energy instead. I stopped trying to impress them years ago. It was simpler to let them believe I was financially naive. It protected my privacy. It protected my peace. But what I didn't realize was that repeated underestimation becomes a kind of quiet narrative. And narratives, if left unchallenged, harden into belief. To my family, I was the reliable one, the helper, the emotionally stable support character, the woman who would marry up financially and be grateful for it. I wasn't angry about it, not yet. I just existed inside the role they handed me. What I didn't know was that one day, that role would be spoken out loud in a way that would force me to decide whether silence was still protecting me or diminishing me. And that was the day everything began to shift. The first small cut didn't feel like a wound at all. It felt like a misunderstanding. Daniel told me about it casually. We were washing dishes in my apartment one Sunday evening, the kind of quiet domestic moment that makes you believe life is uncomplicated. He dried a plate, hesitated, and then said, "Your mom mentioned something interesting today." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious. "She said you've never really cared about financial planning," he continued, "that you're more emotionally driven than strategic." He smiled when he said it as if he expected me to laugh. And I did. Not because it was funny, but because I recognized the shape of the narrative immediately. Emotionally driven. That's a gentle way of saying irrational, or uncalculated, or dependent. I asked him what exactly she had said. He shrugged lightly. "Just that I might want to take the lead on long-term investments once we're married. That it would give you security." Security. It's interesting how people frame control as protection. I dried my hands slowly and asked, "And what did you say?" I told her we'd figure things out together. Together. He meant it kindly. But even in that word, there was an assumption that I was starting from behind, that he would guide, that I would follow. It was subtle. No one raised their voice. No one called me incapable. My mother probably believed she was being supportive. She is always worried about me in a quiet way, as if softness were a vulnerability instead of a discipline. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not angry, not offended, just aware. For the first time, I realized that the family narrative about me had extended beyond casual dinner jokes. It had reached my future husband. It had shaped how he viewed our financial dynamic before we had ever sat down and discussed it ourselves. I replayed conversations from the past year, small remarks I had brushed aside. My aunt asks Daniel about his retirement strategy while turning to me and saying, "You're lucky he's so responsible." Lucky. My father once told him, "Serena's always been idealistic. She doesn't think about numbers the way you do." I work with budgets for a living. I track operational metrics monthly. Numbers are not abstract to me. They are language. But no one had updated their image of me since I was 19 and majoring in literature. To them, I was still the girl who loved poetry and didn't care about stock markets. And I let that image remain, because correcting it would have required revealing something I had built privately, something that wasn't designed for applause. The first small cut wasn't the comment itself. It was the realization that the people closest to me had spoken about my financial value as if it were a settled fact. And Daniel had absorbed it gently, not maliciously, not intentionally, but absorbed it nonetheless. That night, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my black leather ledger. I hadn't opened it in weeks because everything was automated now. I ran my fingers over the early entries, small deposits, modest returns, handwritten calculations from my 20s when every dollar felt fragile. 10 years of discipline. 10 years of choosing not to announce it. I wasn't hurt, not yet, but I understood something important. If I continued staying silent, the narrative would solidify. And one day, it wouldn't just be a joke. It would become a decision made on my behalf. and I had never agreed to that. After that night, nothing dramatic changed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a storm, it settles like dust, thin, barely visible, accumulating quietly on every surface. The comments continued, light, polite, framed as concern. At a family brunch a few weeks later, my father asked Daniel about interest rates and property cycles. They leaned over the table together, voices low and animated. I sipped my coffee and listened. When Daniel mentioned diversifying into long-term holdings, my father nodded approvingly. "That's smart," he said. "Serena's never had the patience for that kind of thing." I almost laughed. Patience. If there is one thing investing requires, it is patience. I had spent years watching markets dip and rise without flinching. Years resisting the temptation to chase trends. Years of choosing consistency over excitement. But I didn't correct him. Instead, I said nothing and passed the fruit bowl. Silence can feel dignified in the moment. It feels like self-control. It feels mature. But repeated often enough, silence begins to look like agreement. I started noticing how the narrative shaped small decisions. When Daniel and I discussed venues for our wedding, my mother pulled him aside and whispered about budgeting. She didn't ask me what I could contribute. She asked him what he was comfortable covering, as if I were an expense instead of a partner. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it complicated. No one was trying to diminish me. They simply couldn't see me clearly, and I had allowed that. There's a strange comfort in being underestimated. Expectations are low. Pressure is minimal. No one scrutinizes your choices. But the cost is subtle. You begin to occupy less space than you actually deserve. One evening, Daniel and I sat down to review some preliminary financial plans for after the wedding. He opened a spreadsheet he had created. His column was detailed: assets, projected growth, potential investments. My column was a placeholder. "Once we combine things," he said, "I'll handle most of the allocation. It'll probably be easier that way." Easier for whom? He wasn't dismissing me intentionally. He was operating based on the information he had been given. Information that my family had reinforced. Information I had never challenged. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. That once we were married, we'd naturally align. That he'd eventually see my capability. But capability unspoken is often capability unseen. I began to understand that disrespect doesn't always feel sharp. Sometimes it feels like being gently edged out of rooms you helped build. And I was complicit in it. I had convinced myself that privacy was a strength, that I didn't need validation, that being quietly competent was enough. But competence that remains invisible can be reassigned to someone else. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Was my silence protecting my peace or protecting their comfort? Because if I continued allowing this narrative, I would eventually wake up inside a life where financial decisions were made for me by people who genuinely believed they were helping, and I would have no one to blame but myself. That was the moment I stopped calling it a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and patterns, if left alone, solidify into identity. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to see the role clearly. Because when a role is handed to you slowly over the years, it feels less like an assignment and more like gravity. You don't question gravity. You just adjust your posture. In my family, I was the emotional infrastructure. If someone forgot a birthday, I sent the gift. If there was tension between relatives, I called each of them separately. If a gathering needed organizing, I made the spreadsheet. I was reliable, available, thoughtful, and invisible. There is a specific kind of woman people become comfortable overlooking. The one who doesn't interrupt, the one who listens more than she speaks, the one who doesn't attach ego to competence. That was me. At first, I wore it with pride. There is dignity in being steady, there is strength in restraint. But over time, I noticed something unsettling. The more reliable I became, the less complex they allowed me to be. I was no longer someone with layered ambitions or private strategies. I was the good one, the stable one, the safe one. And safe people in family systems are often assumed to need less. When wedding planning intensified, the role sharpened. My mother discussed floral budgets with Daniel. My father reviewed seating arrangements with him as if financial oversight automatically belonged in his hands. I was consulted about colors, about music, about emotional tone, not about capital. It would almost be funny if it weren't so precise. One afternoon, I overheard my aunt say to a relative, "Serena's lucky she found someone ambitious. She's never been financially driven." Financially driven, as if discipline were loud, as if ambition required performance. The truth is, I have always been driven, just not publicly. My drive doesn't seek applause, it seeks autonomy. But no one saw that because I never displayed it. I began noticing how often I was described in relational terms. Daniel's fiancé, the nonprofit girl. So nurturing. Rarely was I described as strategic, or independent, or capable of leading. The role they assigned me was comfortable for them. It maintained a balance. Daniel is the provider, I as emotional anchor. And here's the part that stung quietly. Daniel had started to believe it too, not consciously, but subtly. He'd say things like, "Don't stress about the long-term projections. I'll take care of that." I knew he meant to reassure me, but reassurance built on a false assumption is still eroding. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something beyond clarity. It wasn't anger, it was a kind of quiet grief. Not for money, for perception. I had built something real over a decade. A portfolio that represented discipline, foresight, and self-trust. It wasn't just numbers, it was proof that I could take care of myself. And yet the people closest to me believed I was financially weightless, worthless, as I would later learn. I realized then that if I married Daniel without correcting the narrative, I would cement the role permanently. Not because he was controlling, but because structures, once formed, are hard to dismantle. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I just didn't want to disappear inside a misunderstanding of my own making. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as misunderstood. I was undercommunicated, and that is a different responsibility entirely. The shift didn't happen in public. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the most ordinary way possible. I was at my parents' house, sitting at the kitchen counter while my mother flipped through a bridal magazine. The television hummed softly in the background. My father was in the living room on a call. I wasn't expecting anything significant to occur. Then I heard my name, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to travel down the hallway. My father was speaking to someone, an old family friend, I think. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But when you hear your own name followed by a pause, your body listens before your mind does. "She's wonderful," he said, "kind, dependable, but financially, she's never really had value there. Daniel will carry that weight." There was a small laugh on the other end of the line. "Financially, she's never really had value." The words were not shouted. They weren't said with malice. In his voice, I heard certainty, not cruelty. And that's what changed everything. If he had sounded angry, I might have dismissed it as frustration. If he had sounded defensive, I might have excused it as pride. But he sounded convinced. It was a settled belief. In that moment, something inside me grew very still. Not wounded, not reactive, just still. I didn't confront him. I didn't step into the living room and correct the narrative. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to the refrigerator hum. I realized something uncomfortable. I had participated in building this version of myself. Every time I deflected a compliment, every time I laughed at a joke about being bad with money, every time I chose privacy over clarity, I had mistaken invisibility for humility. But humility doesn't require self-erasure. When my father ended the call and walked back into the kitchen, he smiled at me the way he always had, warm, proud, unaware. And I smiled back, not because I agreed, but because I understood. This was no longer about correcting a comment. It was about deciding what kind of life I wanted to enter. Marriage is a structure. It amplifies what already exists. If Daniel entered it believing he was the financial pillar and I was the emotional support beam, that structure would solidify quickly. And I would wake up one day dependent in ways I had never been. Not because I lacked resources, but because I had chosen not to display them. That afternoon, I drove home slowly. The Seattle sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything feel suspended. I didn't turn on the music. I didn't call Daniel. I just thought, for years, I had valued privacy. I didn't want applause. I didn't want family comparisons. My portfolio wasn't a competition. It was a boundary, a quiet insurance policy against uncertainty. But boundaries that remain unseen can be crossed unintentionally. By the time I reached my apartment, the shift had fully settled. I wasn't angry at my father. I wasn't even angry at Daniel. I was clear with myself. Silence was no longer neutral. It was shaping my future. And for the first time, I decided that if I continued being quiet, it would be intentional, not passive. That was the day my silence stopped being a habit and started becoming a strategy. After that Tuesday, I didn't rush into action. That would have been emotional, reactive. Instead, I observed. When Daniel talked about our future finances, I listened more carefully than before. Not to correct him, not to trap him, but to understand the assumptions underneath his confidence. He would say things like, "Once we consolidate everything, I'll optimize the portfolio structure." Optimize. It was a word I knew well. I had been optimizing my own portfolio for years. Tax efficiency, dividend reinvestment, long-term compounding. But he didn't know that. And I let him continue speaking. Because now my silence was deliberate. There's a difference between being unheard and choosing not to speak yet. One feels helpless, the other feels powerful. At a family dinner soon after, my aunt made another soft remark. "It's such a relief that Daniel understands money. Serena's always been more heart than head." This time, I didn't smile automatically. I simply held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. Not confrontational, just steady. She shifted slightly in her chair. I realized something important in that moment. People grow comfortable underestimating you when you help them feel safe doing it. When you laugh along, when you nod, when you confirm their assumptions with your body language. So I stopped confirming. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I just stopped participating in the joke. Daniel began noticing small differences too. When he mentioned handling our future investment strategy, I asked calm, specific questions. What allocation are you considering? How are you balancing growth versus income? What's your plan for tax exposure in 5 years? Not in a challenging tone, in a measured one. He blinked the first time. "Wow," he said lightly. "You've been reading up." I smiled. "Something like that." Silence can evolve. At first, it protects you from conflict. Later, it protects your leverage. I wasn't hiding my knowledge anymore. I was sequencing it. There's power in timing. If I had revealed everything in anger, it would have felt like retaliation. If I had revealed it too early, it would have felt like a performance. I wanted clarity, not drama. In private, I reviewed my accounts more closely. I ensured every document was organized. I updated beneficiary designations. I checked long-term projections with fresh eyes. Not because I was afraid, but clarity demands preparation. The more I reviewed the numbers, the calmer I felt. My portfolio wasn't theoretical. It wasn't a small side account. It was substantial. Years of compounding had turned discipline into something undeniable. I realized then that the greatest irony wasn't that my family thought I was financially worthless. It was that I had more independent liquidity than anyone assumed, and they had no idea. But here's what shifted internally. I no longer needed them to know for validation. I needed Daniel to know about the partnership, and that difference mattered. Silence, when chosen carefully, becomes a kind of mirror. It allows others to reveal what they truly believe without interference. And Daniel unknowingly was revealing his framework. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't domineering. He was operating on incomplete information. Information I had decided, finally, to complete on my terms. While everyone continued speaking about me as if I were financially decorative, I was doing what I've always done best. I was preparing, not dramatically, not obsessively, quietly. There's something almost invisible about disciplined growth. It doesn't announce itself. It compounds in silence. And for 10 years, that's exactly what my life had been doing beneath the surface. They saw the nonprofit's salary and assumed limitations. They saw the modest apartment and assumed dependency. They saw my calm and assumed passivity. What they never noticed was what happened in the margins of my days. Every morning before work, I reviewed market summaries with my coffee. Not headlines meant to provoke emotion, data meant to inform positioning. I tracked long-term index performance across decades, not weeks. I understood volatility the way some people understand weather patterns. When markets dipped sharply 3 years ago, my brother panicked and liquidated half his holdings. He called it risk management. I called it emotional decision making. I did nothing, and over time that number multiplied. My black leather ledger still sat in my desk drawer, though most of my accounts were digital now. The early pages were filled with tight handwriting, calculations, projections, risk ratios I had taught myself to understand through late-night research and trial. No one celebrated those pages with me. No one needed to. That was never the point. After my father's comment, I didn't rush to prove him wrong. I refined my position instead. I met with a financial advisor, not because I lacked knowledge, but because strategy benefits from perspective. I wanted a third-party review, confirmation that my structure was solid. It was. Diverse index funds, dividend-generating equities, a few carefully timed long-term growth positions, conservative debt exposure, strong liquidity. When the advisor looked up at me and said, "You've built something very disciplined here," I didn't feel pride. I felt steadiness, because I already knew. What they never noticed was how often I chose delayed gratification. I drove my car 5 years longer than necessary. I skipped upgrading apartments when my salary increased. I invested raises before I adjusted my lifestyle. Not because I was deprived, because I valued autonomy more than appearance. Meanwhile, family conversations continued circling around my supposed financial innocence. My aunt once joked, "Serena would rather buy books than stocks." I own both. But I let the comment float. Preparation, I've learned, is most powerful when it doesn't seek witnesses. I wasn't building a portfolio to surprise anyone. I was building it so that I would never be cornered by circumstance or by assumption. And slowly, something deeper crystallized inside me. The issue wasn't whether my family respected my financial intelligence. It was whether my future marriage would be built on an equal footing. That required evidence, not an argument, not an emotional appeal. Documentation. So I organized everything. Account summaries, performance histories, net worth statements, tax-efficient structures. I compiled them into a single clean digital file, clear, unambiguous. No theatrics, just numbers. Because numbers don't shout, they stand. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to defend myself. I would simply present reality. They underestimated the quiet one, and the quiet one had been compounding. The private reveal didn't happen the way dramatic stories would suggest. There was no dramatic folder slid across a table, no raised voice, no, "You were wrong about me." It happened on a quiet Thursday night in my apartment. Daniel and I were sitting at the dining table with laptops open. He had suggested we start merging some financial planning documents in preparation for meeting with a wedding planner. "I'll send over my portfolio summary," he said casually. "Then we can build projections from there." "From there?" I nodded and said, "Before we do that, there's something I should show you." He looked up, curious but relaxed. I turned my laptop toward him. On the screen was a clean spreadsheet summary. Total assets, diversification breakdown, historical growth, liquidity position, 10 years of performance data. He blinked once, then leaned closer. "What is this?" "My portfolio." There was a pause, not tense, not dramatic, just recalibration. He scrolled, slowly. The silence stretched longer than I expected. His posture changed subtly, less casual, more attentive. "I didn't know you were investing like this," he said carefully. "I never said I wasn't." It wasn't defensive, just factual. He kept scrolling. "This is substantial." I nodded. "It's disciplined." I watched something shift behind his eyes, not embarrassment exactly, not shame, but recognition. Recognition that the story he had inherited about me was incomplete. "I thought," he began, then stopped. "You thought I wasn't financially strategic," I finished gently. He looked at me, searching for irritation. He didn't find any. I didn't mean to assume, he said. I know, and I did know. That's what made the moment steady instead of explosive. He hadn't tried to diminish me. He had simply accepted a narrative offered to him repeatedly. I didn't present the portfolio like a weapon. I presented it in context. This is why I haven't been anxious during our planning conversations, I continued. I'm not financially dependent. I never was. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. How long have you been building this? Since I was 22. Another recalibration. The room felt different now. Not heavier, clearer. He closed his laptop. Why didn't you tell me? That question mattered. Because I didn't want it to define me, and I didn't think I needed to prove anything. And now? Now I think partnership requires full visibility. That was the entire confrontation. No accusations about my family, no listing of comments, no emotional speech about being underestimated. Just data and honesty. The most powerful part wasn't the total value. It was the fact that I had built it quietly, without external validation, without anyone guiding me. The reveal wasn't about money. It was about agency. And in that quiet dining room, I watched Daniel adjust his understanding of me, not downward, not defensively, upward. Respect doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives with silence and a long, thoughtful stare at numbers that cannot be argued with. That night, nothing exploded, but something permanent shifted. After that Thursday night, the air between Daniel and me felt different. Not strained, not fragile, balanced. He asked more questions, not to challenge, but to understand. We spent the next few evenings reviewing our portfolios side by side. For the first time, the spreadsheet had two fully formed columns. Two histories, two strategies, equal weight, and yet something still hovered quietly beneath the surface. Because while Daniel had recalibrated, my family hadn't. They were still speaking in the old narrative, still referencing my lack of financial drive, still reassuring Daniel subtly that he would be the pillar. I now stood at a crossroads. I had three options. The first was the easiest. Do nothing. Let Daniel hold the knowledge privately. Allow my family to continue believing what they believed. It would preserve comfort, avoid friction, maintain the image they were attached to. The second was confrontational. Sit them down, list every comment, expose every assumption, and correct the record publicly. That would satisfy pride, but it would humiliate them. And humiliation rarely leads to understanding. The third option was irreversible in a quieter way. I could restructure the dynamic without announcement. Not to punish, not to embarrass, but to remove the possibility that anyone could treat me as financially weightless again. That required clarity, not emotion. One evening, Daniel said something that clarified everything for me. We should probably meet with a joint financial advisor soon, he suggested, to integrate everything properly. I nodded. We will. But then I added calmly, before we do that, I want a prenuptial agreement. He didn't react with offense. He reacted with surprise. A prenup? Yes. There was no tension in my voice. I'm not asking for protection because I distrust you, I continued. I'm asking because I believe in clarity. We both built something independently. That deserves structure. He was quiet for a long moment. I assumed you wouldn't want one, he admitted. Why? He hesitated. I guess. I thought it would feel transactional to you. Transactional. Interesting how assumptions layer. I held his gaze. Security isn't transactional. It's responsible. That was the decision. Not to prove my worth. Not to correct every relative. Not to deliver a speech about underestimation. But to formalize equality. A prenuptial agreement would do something powerful without drama. It would acknowledge legally and structurally that I entered the marriage with substantial assets of my own. It would protect both of us. It would eliminate any silent hierarchy before it formed. And most importantly, it would render the financially worthless narrative obsolete without me ever repeating the phrase. The decision was irreversible because once that document existed, the myth of my dependence could never survive intact. I wasn't choosing conflict. I was choosing architecture. Daniel eventually nodded, slowly. If that's what makes you feel secure, he said, we'll do it. It makes me feel equal, I replied. That was the turning point. Not loud, not dramatic, Just a quiet woman deciding that her future would not be shaped by a misunderstanding she had the power to correct. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it to anyone. That's the thing about structural change. If you do it correctly, it doesn't require an audience. Daniel and I scheduled a consultation with an attorney who specialized in prenuptial agreements. We approached it clinically, transparently. There was no tension in the room, only paperwork and clarity. I brought organized documentation, asset summaries, investment accounts, and historical valuations. I didn't dramatize them. I simply placed them on the table. The attorney reviewed the numbers and looked up briefly. "You've both done well independently," she said. "This will be straightforward." Straightforward. That word felt earned. The agreement outlined what we had built before marriage, how future joint assets would be structured, and how individual investments would remain protected. It wasn't adversarial, it was respectful. Daniel asked thoughtful questions. I answered calmly. What struck me most wasn't the legal language, it was the shift in tone. The conversation was no longer centered around him handling our finances. It was about coordination, alignment, shared strategy. Quietly, something equalized. Meanwhile, my family continued speaking in old patterns. My aunt texted Daniel about taking care of our girl. My father joked about teaching him how to manage household budgets. Daniel no longer laughed in the same way. He didn't correct them either. Not yet. But his posture changed. His silence was different now, more informed. I noticed it at Sunday dinner when my father said, "Serena's always trusted others with financial decisions." Daniel simply replied, "I think you might be underestimating her." It wasn't confrontational. It was measured. My father smiled, assuming it was flattery. He had no idea, and I didn't rush to enlighten him. There's a temptation, when you finally hold proof, to reveal it prematurely, to savor the surprise, to watch the shock register. But that wasn't my goal. My goal was structural correction, not emotional victory. The prenup was signed quietly 2 months before our wedding. It sat in a secure digital vault alongside the rest of my documents. Not a weapon, not a secret, a boundary. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No family intervention, no accusations, no tense phone calls. Because the true shift had already occurred where it mattered most, inside the architecture of my future. I no longer needed to argue about my worth. It was documented. I no longer needed to defend my independence. It was codified. And perhaps most importantly, Daniel now saw me clearly. Not as someone to protect financially, but as someone to build with. No one outside our relationship understood the magnitude of that shift. They still believed I was the quiet one, the gentle one, the financially naive one. And I let them, because sometimes the most powerful move is correcting reality without correcting every mouth that misstates it. The consequences of clarity don't arrive loudly. They unfold gradually, and soon others would begin to feel that shift without fully understanding why. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived with subtle confusion. A few weeks after the prenuptial agreement was finalized, Daniel and I attended another family dinner. Same dining table, same polished glasses, same familiar rhythm of conversation. But something small had changed. When my father brought up long-term financial planning, he instinctively turned to Daniel. "So, have you started organizing everything yet?" he asked. "Merging accounts? Setting up the structure?" Daniel paused, and for the first time, he didn't answer alone. "We're structuring it together," he said evenly. "Serena actually has some strong positions we're integrating carefully." The table went quiet, not dramatically, just a half second too long. My aunt tilted her head. "Strong positions?" Daniel nodded casually. "She's been investing for years." Years. My mother looked at me, surprised but not alarmed. "I didn't know you were that interested in finance." Interested. I took a sip of water before responding. I've always been disciplined about long-term planning. No defensiveness, no elaboration. Just a fact. The room recalibrated in small, almost invisible ways. The conversation shifted topics, but something lingered. A subtle discomfort, not because I had attacked anyone, but because a quiet assumption had been disrupted. Over the next few gatherings, the tone changed further. My aunt stopped making jokes about me being bad with money. My father asked me directly once about market volatility. My mother hesitated before telling Daniel to take care of everything. No one apologized. No one referenced the past comments. But something had been unsettled. What fascinated me most was this. The loss they felt wasn't about money. It was about narrative control. For years, they had understood me in a specific way. It made sense to them. It fit neatly into the family hierarchy. My brother is the risk taker, my cousin the tech success, Daniel the provider, me the steady heart. When that hierarchy shifted, even slightly, it destabilized more than a dinner conversation. It forced them to reevaluate their assumptions, and reevaluation is uncomfortable. I could see it in my father's eyes one evening when he asked, cautiously, "How long have you been investing?" "About a decade," I replied. He nodded slowly, processing the timeline. 10 years meant this wasn't sudden. It wasn't inspired by Daniel. It wasn't reactionary. It predated the narrative. And that realization landed quietly. There was no explosion, no accusation of betrayal, just a growing awareness that they had misunderstood me for a long time. The consequences continued unfolding in Daniel, too. He began consulting me before making financial suggestions. Not out of obligation, but respect. Our conversations became collaborative rather than instructive. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because this wasn't about winning, it was about alignment. When people underestimate you, correcting them loudly may satisfy pride. Correcting them structurally reshapes reality. And reality, once reshaped, doesn't need defending. The quiet one had shifted the foundation, and now everyone could feel it without fully understanding how it happened. The discomfort didn't explode. It thickened. About a month before the wedding, my parents invited Daniel and me over for what they called a quick planning dinner. The phrase sounded harmless. It rarely is. We sat in the living room after dessert, coffee untouched on the table. My mother folded her hands in her lap the way she does when she's rehearsed something internally. "There's something we've been meaning to ask," she began carefully. I already knew. My father cleared his throat. "Daniel mentioned you've been investing for some time." The pause before investing carried weight. "Yes," I said. "How substantial are we talking?" he asked, trying to sound casual. That was the first time I felt the full shift land. For years, my financial position had been irrelevant to them. Suddenly, it was pressing. I answered simply, "Substantial enough to require legal clarity before marriage." Silence. My mother blinked. "Legal clarity?" "We signed a prenuptial agreement," Daniel said calmly. The air changed. Not hostile, just startled. "A prenup?" My aunt, who had apparently been invited into this conversation without my knowledge, leaned forward. "Why would you need that?" It wasn't an accusation. It was confusion mixed with something else, displacement. Because the narrative they had been operating on no longer made sense. My father looked between us. We thought Daniel would be managing most of that. There it was. The framework laid bare. Daniel didn't rush to reassure them. He didn't say, "Don't worry." He said, "We're both managing our own assets and our shared ones." The conversation faltered after that. My mother tried to soften it. "We just don't want finances to create tension." "They won't," I replied gently. That's why we structured it clearly. What I could see, in real time, was something impossible to reverse. They weren't upset about the prenup itself. They were unsettled because the role they had assigned me no longer existed. And once someone sees you clearly, even partially, it's very hard to return to a smaller version of you. My father leaned back slowly. "I wish we'd known you were thinking about these things." I held his gaze. "You never asked." It wasn't sharp, it was honest. That sentence settled into the room with more weight than any argument could have carried. No one raised their voice. No one apologized. But something final had occurred. They couldn't return to telling people I was financially inexperienced. They couldn't comfortably joke about Daniel carrying me. The narrative had expired. And expired narratives create awkward silence. On the drive home, Daniel reached for my hand. "I think they feel embarrassed," he said quietly. "Maybe," I replied. But here's the truth I understood in that moment. Embarrassment is what happens when reality arrives late. And reality had arrived too late for them to gently adjust it. The quiet one had already built her foundation. And foundations, once poured, don't reshape themselves to make others comfortable. The final conversation happened 3 days before the wedding. Not because I demanded it, because my father asked. He called and said, "Can you stop by? Just you." His voice wasn't stern, it was measured. That told me everything I needed to know. I drove to my parents' house in the late afternoon. The light through the windows was soft, familiar. I had grown up in that living room. I knew where the floorboards creaked. We sat across from each other at the dining table. No audience this time, no extended relatives. "I owe you a conversation," he began. I didn't rush to fill the silence. He folded his hands, mirroring the posture my mother often uses. "I think we may have misunderstood you." "May have." "That happens," I said gently. He exhaled. "When Daniel told me about your investments and the prenup, I was surprised. I could tell. I didn't realize you were operating at that level." Operating at that level. It wasn't an apology. It was an admission of miscalculation. For a moment, I saw him differently. Not as the architect of a narrative, but as someone who had relied on outdated information for too long. "You've always been so quiet about your achievements," he continued. "We thought you just weren't interested in that world." "I wasn't interested in broadcasting it," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I suppose we filled in the blanks ourselves." "Yes." There was no accusation in my tone, just confirmation. He looked down at the table. "When I said you didn't have financial value, I didn't mean it the way it sounds." I met his eyes calmly. "I know, and I did know. That's why I hadn't reacted with heat. He hadn't intended harm. He had simply mistaken silence for absence." "That must have hurt," he said quietly. "It clarified things," I answered. He studied my face, perhaps searching for resentment. He didn't find any. "I'm proud of you," he said after a long pause. That sentence would have meant something very different to me years ago. I might have craved it. I might have waited for it. Now it felt steady, appreciated, but not necessary. "Thank you," I replied. The conversation didn't stretch into emotional confession. It didn't need to. There was no dramatic embrace, no tears, just recalibration. As I stood to leave, he said one more thing. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," I said softly. "You should have." But I smiled when I said it. Because this confrontation wasn't about punishing him for underestimating me. It was about ensuring he would never do it again, without raising my voice, without humiliating him, without listing every comment that had shaped the misunderstanding. The correction had already happened. This was simply an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement delivered without heat lands far deeper than anger ever could. The wedding came and went without drama. No whispered financial jokes. No subtle remarks about Daniel carrying me. No concerned glances about whether I understood what I was signing. The structure had already been corrected, and because it had been corrected quietly, the day itself remained light. But the real change wasn't visible in photographs. It was internal. For years, I had believed that dignity meant absorbing misunderstanding without reaction, that strength meant not needing to be seen accurately. If my foundation was solid, it didn't matter how others described it. I still believe in restraint. I still believe in calm. But I no longer confuse silence with humility. I learned that clarity is not ego. That structure is not aggression. That protecting your position doesn't require attacking anyone else's. Daniel and I now speak about money the same way we speak about travel plans or long-term goals, collaboratively. There is no invisible hierarchy in the room, no silent assumption about who carries more weight. Equality isn't loud, it's simply balanced. My relationship with my parents shifted too, not into distance, but into recalibration. My father asks me questions now. Real ones. Not because he doubts Daniel, but because he recognizes I have perspective. The most interesting part? I didn't become louder. I didn't change my personality. I didn't start announcing my achievements at dinner tables. I remained the quiet one. The difference is that now my quiet carries definition. When someone makes an assumption, I don't rush to soften it with a laugh. I don't participate in narratives that shrink me. I let the silence sit long enough to signal that it is an agreement. And when necessary, I provide information, cleanly, calmly, without apology. The portfolio still exists. It continues to grow. not as a symbol of revenge, but as a symbol of autonomy. It reminds me that preparation is powerful, that compounding works in more than just financial markets. Self-trust compounds, boundaries compound, respect compounds. They underestimated the quiet one, but here's the truth I carry now. Underestimation only limits you if you accept the smaller role. I don't resent my family. I don't resent Daniel. They operated on incomplete data. The only person responsible for correcting that data was me. And once I did, everything aligned, without noise, without spectacle. I am still Serena, still calm, still reflective, but no longer misdefined. If you had told me years ago that the most powerful moment of my engagement would involve a spreadsheet, I would have smiled politely. Not because it sounded absurd, but because I would have known something others didn't. Power doesn't always arrive in raised voices. It doesn't arrive in humiliation. It doesn't arrive in proving someone wrong in front of a crowd. Sometimes it arrives in documentation, in preparation, in the quiet decision to stop allowing yourself to be misdefined. My family told my fiancé I was financially worthless. They didn't scream it. They didn't weaponize it. They believed it gently. And that's what made it dangerous. But here's what I've learned. When people underestimate you, you have two choices. You can argue with the narrative, or you can outgrow it so thoroughly that it collapses on its own. I chose structure over spectacle. I didn't expose my portfolio to embarrass anyone. I revealed it to establish equality. I didn't ask for a prenuptial agreement to create distance. I asked for it to create clarity. And because of that, no one lost face. But everyone adjusted. The quiet one was never financially worthless. She was simply not performing her value for an audience. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Silence is not weakness, unless it protects a lie about you. If you've built something meaningful, financially, emotionally, professionally, you don't owe the world a performance. But you do owe yourself correct architecture. So let me ask you something gently. Have you ever allowed someone to define your value simply because it felt easier than correcting them? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.